Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Abolition Democracy 1113 on Abolish Oil. At our last session with the brilliant abolitionist thinker Dorothy Roberts and the remarkable artist Timber Hudson, we opened with Malcolm X's autobiography and W.E.B. Du Bois's magnificent book, Black Reconstruction in America, with which I've opened many of these seminars. We were addressing the abolition of family policing, the abolition of the family regulation ordeal, a foundational piece of the carceral mesh that surrounds us. Today, we turn to another panel of the triptych, the fight against fossil fuels, against oil and pipelines. And so I'd like to start by reading this time, not from W.E.B. Du Bois, but from the Red Nations, the Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth. Let me just share the cover of that book. The Red Deal, this is from the Red Deal, this is the Red Nations Red Deal. The Red Deal is a platform that calls for demilitarization, police and prison abolition, abolishing ICE, tearing down all border walls, indigenous liberation, decolonization, land restoration, treaty rights, free healthcare, free education, free housing, full citizenship, equal protection for undocumented relatives, a complete moratorium on oil, gas, coal, and carbon extraction and emissions, a transition to an economy that benefits everyone and that extends the exploitation of the global South, that ends the exploitation of the global South and indigenous nations for resources, safe and free public transportation, restoration of indigenous agriculture, food sovereignty, restoration of waterways and watersheds, denuclearization, Black self-determination and autonomy, gender and sexual identity, two-spirit, trans, and queer liberation, and the restoration of sacred sites. This is an ambitious program that militates in favor of an integrated view of social transformation that simultaneously attacks the effects of colonialism, of extractive capitalism, and of the fossil fuel industry, all interlinked. Now, in planning this session with Reinhold Martin, I was worried last summer, and we planned this all the way back in the summer, that it might feel somewhat forced to bring the struggle against global climate change into conversation with abolition democracy. But the work of our guests today make it plain that this relationship is absolutely necessary and foundational, that we will not make progress on the climate without abolition democracy. That's what we're here to talk about today. And it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome to our seminar extraordinary thinkers and activists. So please join me, starting with Alyssa Battistoni, who has kicked us off with a brilliant post on Reinhold's essay. Alyssa is a political theorist working and teaching on topics related to political economy, environmental and climate politics, feminism, and the history of political thought. She's currently an environmental fellow at Harvard University, and she will be beginning a position here as a professor of political science at Barnard College in the fall, so in fall 2021. So we're really delighted to welcome you in anticipation of your arrival, Alyssa. Thanks so much for joining us. Alyssa is the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal with Kate Aronoff, Daniela Aldana Cohen, and Thea Ria Francos, which was out with Verso in 2019, and is currently working on a book titled Free Gifts, Capitalism, and the Politics of Nature. Now, Reinhold Martin, I was, of course, we've been working on this since last summer, thinking about this, in part building on your essay, Abolish Oil. It's posted, everyone should really have read the essay that Reinhold wrote and the responses from Alyssa and Daniela and everyone that really shaped this conversation. Reinhold Martin, of course, is professor of architecture in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation here at Columbia University, where he also directs the Temple Hoyle Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture. His work centers on histories of space, power, and the aesthetic imagination, particularly as mediated by technical infrastructures. He's the author of The Organizational Complex, Architecture, Media, and Corporate Space, MIT 2003, and Utopia's Ghost, Architecture and Postmodernism, again, Minnesota 2010, co-author of books, but his new book is out this month. And so we're really thrilled, and we're all gonna read it and learn. It's called Knowledge Worlds, Media, Materiality, and the Making of the Modern University. And it's just published this month by Columbia University Press. It's got a beautiful cover that looks, what is it on the cover? It looks like a panopticon, but it's actually the Law Library. Put on you're muted, Reinhold. Reinhold, you're muted, sorry.
Thank you. Yes, it's Law Library, believe it or not. Sorry.
Okay, great. And basically, what the book does in its words is reconceives the university, right, as a media complex comprising a network of infrastructures and operations through which knowledge is made, conveyed, and withheld. How appropriate for us. And maybe we can talk about that too. Daniela Gandorfer joins us from Vienna, Austria, where it's a lot later than it is right now in New York City. So it's actually Friday morning. Thanks for joining us so late, Daniela. A dear friend of the 1313s for many, many years and participant. Daniela is a postdoctoral scholar at UC Santa Cruz right now, working with the quantum physicist and philosopher Karen Barad. And she's a co-founder, Daniela is a co-founder of the Logische Fantasie Lab. You want to try and say that better than I just did, maybe? No, it's good. Logische Fantasie Lab. Okay. It's a research lab that challenges injustices resulting from political, legal, economic, social, physical, environmental entanglements. Her research and teaching focuses on developing methods of legal and critical analysis that actively tackle activist, colonialist, extractivist, colonialist, and capitalist modes of violence. And her book, Metaphorics on the Laws of Theory, is forthcoming with Duke University Press. So thanks, Daniela, for joining us as well. Now, we also are joined by Noah Smith-Drelich, my colleague, and there you are, Noah, thanks for joining, colleague and lead counsel on our Standing Rock litigation at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, or the Initiative for a Just Society. And Noah is now in Chicago virtually on the faculty at Chicago Kent College of Law, which he joined in 2020 as a professor of law there. And his research really focuses on questions that for us are at the heart of these debates, the law and procedure of, in part, tort remedies, civil rights remedies, issues of qualified immunity, which is what we're going to be litigating and at the Eighth Circuit, or you're going to be arguing at the Eighth Circuit, upholding our good ruling on qualified immunity in the Standing Rock case. Noah was here at Columbia last year with us, or the year before, a couple of years as a fellow. And before that, Noah was a staff attorney for the ACLU's North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming affiliate, and of course continues to do that work. He's lead counsel in our litigation, Thunderhawk versus County of Morton, which is a class action suit challenging the police abuses, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the top before going into the more theoretical connections between these issues and abolition democracy with Alyssa. All right, I also want to welcome warmly, and it's thanks to Noah and his work in North Dakota. I want to welcome warmly the Iron Bull Singers. So please join us if you can. We've got, hi. You've got one more member of the Iron Bull Singers right now. Hey, Red Rock. So we've got Red Rock Perkins on the right, holding your baby. Kendall Little Owl next to him there. John Eagleshield Jr. Next over there. And Spencer Little Owl on the far left. Hi, Spencer. Thanks so much for joining us. The Iron Bowl Singers was started in the early 1990s by your father, Orville Little Owl. And the name Iron Bull came from his mother, Josephine Iron Bull, who was from Cannonball area on Standing Rock. So your drum group was originally started and traveled around the California area and later in the Midwest. And you've got many songs from Standing Rock, and we'll talk a little bit about it and the movement at Standing Rock. And since your father's passing, since Orville's passing in 2006, you, the sons, Kendall and Spencer and Little Owl, have been carrying on the family drum name. And in the process, you've met a lot of friends, right, on the trail. So anyway, it's my real pleasure for everyone to be here. And Reinhold, it's really a pleasure to actually see this come to fruition. Really, I think it was a conversation in Riverside Park, one of those mass
Right.
conversations at the beginning of the epidemic, and your essay, Abolish Oil, that really has kind of got us here, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what I was going to say exactly. And first of all, to thank everybody for joining. You know, yeah, the conversations in the park have been, I think, very sustaining to all of us over this difficult time. And in particular, these kind of long walks that you and I've taken a couple of times, I think, you know, at a distance, met with masks and so on, to in a sense pick up where we left off also in Paris. And for example, and when I was able to join for the previous session of 1313, of course, the many, I realize it's 6 years of these seminars that you've been with your colleagues running. I did want to kind of reiterate my gratitude on behalf, I think, of many of our colleagues to Bernard for what you've been doing with this work. This has been really a place for us to gather now on screen, but previously around tables in, you know, places that we hope to return to that have been really amazingly generative, I think, for the intellectual community here, you know, obviously at Columbia and well beyond.
Thrilling to be in this conversation with you for so many years, really.
Yeah.
Every single one. And Daniela, too, you were at so many of them when we were, you know, meeting in person. And yeah, so this one is actually 613.
Yeah.
So hopefully there'll be 1313s of the 1313s, maybe. We'll see. We'll see if we can keep it up. But thanks. It's really nice to be here together now to think about this question of how abolishing oil and the fossil fuels, the industry, and everything surrounding that relate to these pivotal questions of abolition democracy. And so as Alyssa was writing in her piece on the politics, right? So much of it goes through the protest movement now and through the extraordinarily coercive policing, to call it mildly, the form I call it counter-insurgency policing that's going on, and that was going on at Standing Rock. Now, Noah, you spent a lot of time at Standing Rock. You were with the ACLU, and so why don't you tell us a little bit about how you met the Iron Bowl Singers, and then maybe we can turn it over to them.
Yeah, so I mean, I met Red Rock and Johnny in particular. I guess this was 4 or 5 years ago now. It would have been at the camps at Standing Rock. Red Rock's wife and my wife know each other well and work together still to this day. Yeah, I think I first heard them sing at Standing Rock. Actually, was thinking about this. It's nice to get to hear them again. It's been a while.
Right. Wonderful. And so, so Red Rock, you all were at the water protector movement at Standing Rock, and what were you doing there?
Yeah, what were you doing?
We were at Standing Rock from the beginning until the police came and forcefully closed everything down. But we were there to kind of help organize, and we're part of the security and help organize people that were coming in and kind of making them feel welcome and kind of setting that tone for visitors coming on to Oceti Shakoi land.
Great, thanks for your work there. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the litigation. So we'll come back to that afterwards. But I thought what we wanted to do, I thought it would be really special to begin with a drum circle and with your voices. So let's do this. The Iron Bull Singers, why don't we, the rest of us, are gonna turn off our videos, and why don't we let you take it away for now.
Oh,
thank you so much. It's really, really great to hear you again. Johnny, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the song you just sang.
What year was that? Yeah. I think, well, the song we just sang about 2012, actually, when we first started singing together, 2011, 2012. It's one of the very first songs that I made, along with my brothers here, when we first started traveling around together and singing together. And the song, it translates to, whoever wants to dance, this song is yours. So have fun dancing. I am Iron Bull with a good heart. We come here to sing. That's the story that's the information about the song.
And is this a song that you ever sang at camp? I know that I heard you guys at camp. Is it more like, did you do more round dance singing at camp, or?
In the beginning, we did everything. We sang on the drum when it wasn't cold. There are no summer days. We sang on the drum during the daytime, and then in the evening time, it's when we have people come around and dance, and then we get our hand drums and start singing round dance songs more towards the nighttime.
And like, what did that mean to you to be at like this land that, you know, people have lived in for so long, singing these songs with people at camp?
You know, I was talking with a lexi of mine, an uncle of mine, and there were times during camp that it was kind of deja vu, because during that time, west of where camp was a place we called Striker Camp, where Ocheti Shakoni did get together and meet. And towards the mouth of the Cannonball River, they used to do that also. Before the flood, before they flooded the river, there used to be a giant tree. They said 6 men, arm to arm, would be able to go around that tree trunk. But after the flood, that tree was no more. And that tree, they said, was a talking tree. And if you ever wanted to know answers, that's where they would go.
Johnny, do you think you guys can do another song for us?
Yes, we can do another song, of course.
Thank you again. This is, yeah, really wonderful. It's really an honor to have you singing for us like this. Johnny, can you talk a little more about this song? Or
that song was made by the two younger brothers, Kendall and Spencer. Uncle Ralph Little Owl made that one from Twin Buttes, North Dakota.
And do you want to talk about what the song's about, or Kendall, do you want to talk, or it's all right if you don't?
Well, just a straight song. I don't know too much about on our Mandan side, but I know my uncle Ralph Little Owl was a really well-known song composer back in his time, and we actually learned that song from one of our cousins. His name is Mile One Arrow, lives in Ashland, Montana, but he taught us that song last year. That we kind of came across each other's paths at Sundance we go to, and so kind of ever since then, because he knows about our Little Owl side of the family, Fort Berthold, and me and my brother, we know some of our family, but not too much of it. So after meeting Mile, he really showed us a lot of songs that our Uncle Ralph Little Owl showed him and showed a lot of people. But that song is just a straight song, and there's nothing really, I don't know how you say it, like kind of really nothing special about it. It's just a song someone composed when they're like making songs, I guess. But it's kind of just a social song. You can use it for whatever you want, whatever it feels fitting for.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So you guys were in charge of security, and of course, security became a big issue at the Water is Life movement, and in part that's how we all got to know Noah, and then with the closing down of the camp, forcible closing down of the camp. Noah, tell us a little bit about this lawsuit that we've got going right now, and how it relates to there are a couple of other lawsuits regarding the Standing Rock Water is Life movement.
Yeah, so there's many different parts to a movement. I mean, the main part is the grassroots side of things, and this is really where like these guys were doing the work and the lifting, and I'm always just in awe of the work that I know that they were all doing out at Standing Rock. There's also obviously a legal component that comes to any movement. I think something that talks about something that comes up regularly is the criminal defense side, which is very important. I think often the civil side of movements can get less attention, but isn't less important. So at Standing Rock, in response to the Water is Life movement and these camps that came up on the border of the Standing Rock Reservation, on land that is part of the Oceti-Sakowin, what was recognized as the Great Sioux Nation, and two different treaties the U.S. government signed with the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people, the Oceti-Sakowin, the 7 council fires. So these camps arose on this land, and the state and local police, in part of their efforts to really suppress the movement, a lot of what's been published is the excessive force that the police used, but what has one police tactic that has gotten less attention, but wasn't less significant, was that the local police in particular really took the lead in closing Highway 1806, which is the primary road connecting the Standing Rock Reservation to Bismarck and Mandan, which are the nearest large towns in the area. So the local police, Morton County, closed the road, Highway 1806. They closed it for 5 months, and they didn't close it for everyone. So if you were the tribe or one of its supporters, you weren't allowed to use the road. But if you were working on the pipeline or were affiliated with the pipeline, like private security, or if you were a white local resident, they actually allowed people to use this road. And so the lawsuit that we've brought is around this road closure. It did a lot of harm in the community, made it much more difficult to get between the reservation and like the site of the nearest airport, the nearest shopping, nearest hospital. Actually, where everyone's coming in from right now is a community that's on the other side of the road closure. So during the road closure, where our Iron Bull singers are, I guess I was going to say Skyping in from, but Zooming in from would have been cut off from the reservation during this time. So it's a federal civil rights.
Basically, the road closure tried to kind of completely crush the movement, essentially, by not allowing any movement and not allowing any protest on that strip, which was the central space near the pipeline, right?
Yeah, and part of also what it did is that one of the sites along the road that people have been going to speak and pray most frequently was in a site that had been identified as like a sacred and ceremonial site, and the closure closed that as well. So it was an effort to really just stop people from going to these camps along the Standing Rock border, and also from going to this like roadside area that had been a very important area to the movement and to the local community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we filed the lawsuit, what was that, 2018, right?
Yes.
And so where does it stand right now?
Yeah, so federal civil rights lawsuits take a long time. We filed it in 2018. The way these lawsuits work is, in effect, defendants have really two main attempts to try to get a lawsuit dismissed before it goes to trial. And so a lot of what lawsuits are defendants trying to get rid of a lawsuit before it gets to trial. So shortly after we filed the lawsuit, the defendants took their first big swing at the lawsuit through what's called a motion to dismiss. They all filed motions to dismiss. It's a big, serious swing. It's a reason why a lot of lawsuits are ultimately dismissed. And
but particularly on qualified immunity, right?
Yes. So qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that essentially tilts the scales in favor of police. This isn't me being biased and talking. That's like the goal of the doctrine. And so the motions to dismiss were filed based on the doctrine of qualified immunity. And after about 2 years of sitting on the case and considering it and thinking about it, the district court judge assigned to this denied their motions to dismiss. So essentially allowing the lawsuit to proceed. It was a very big victory for the lawsuit. For several of the defendants, what this means is that we're now in what's called discovery, which means that we're allowed to ask lots of questions about what happened. And we now have the power of the court behind us to compel them to answer it. Several of the other defendants have filed an appeal in the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, which they're allowed to do in part because qualified immunity, this doctrine that, again, is intended to tilt the scales in favor of police, gives defendants rights to appeal that they wouldn't otherwise have. So the defendants have taken that advantage of that right. They filed the appeal. The appeal is currently all briefed, which means at this point we're waiting to have an oral argument in front of the court for that.
And the ACLU intervened as an amicus for us, and it's going to be argued in front of the Eighth Circuit actually pretty soon. They're setting a date for that for the Eighth Circuit. And so that piece on the unqualified immunity against the state and the county is going to be argued at the Eighth Circuit. And meanwhile, the litigation against Tiger Swan, which is a private security firm. People probably know a lot about Tiger Swan. We'll pop in some information about Tiger Swan in the chat. Because they were really engaged in counterinsurgency practices there. That is ongoing with discovery, with a trial date scheduled for the time being in August of this summer, right? And also against the county there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's moving along, and we're it's exciting. It's going well, and I think we're really happy with how it's all going. It's frustrating how slow of a process this is, but it's just the nature of federal litigation. It's
just say a word about our plaintiffs.
Yeah, so we have what's called a putative class action, which means that we're seeking to represent a very large group of plaintiffs. there's a legal step before you can call yourself officially a class action where the judge has to certify it as a class, and we haven't filed for certification yet. That's going to come later in this litigation. Right now, we're litigating this on behalf of 4 plaintiffs. Washte Wee Young is an enrolled member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, was formerly the tribe's historic preservation officer, and is was somebody who was really a part of the movement. Phyllis Thunderhawk is also an enrolled member of the tribe, lives currently in, I believe it's in Mandan, which is this town on the other side of the closure, had at the time a small cafe on the Standing Rock reservation. So the closure made it much more difficult for her and her customers to go to her cafe. Also, Reverend John Floberg is the local Episcopalian minister of the town in Cannonball, also lives on the other side of the road closure. So the road closure made it much more difficult for him to, and often impossible for him to travel and to his congregation. And then finally, Jose Jagnier, who is actually traveled to Standing Rock from New York to work at the school at the camps, and like everyone else who traveled during this period from out of state, it was made much more difficult to travel because of this road closure. So those are the 4 plaintiffs in this case.
And as co-counsel, we have an extraordinary crew of Columbia Law School students, right? Probably who have been doing women's and men's work on this case, right? An extraordinary crew.
I think genuinely an all-star team of students. I think both Columbia College and Columbia Law School, who are doing work that I think most second and third year associates at sophisticated firms would be jealous to do. Both the quality and the nature of the work they're doing.
Yeah, so it's an incredible team, and we want to send a special shout out, thank you to all of the students working on this litigation. I think we have one. I think Arabella's on this in this seminar as well. So I know Arabella's working on it. Big thank you, Colombier and others as well, doing amazing.
And Arabella, just to give her a little more of a shout out, as part of our appeals team, has done some really amazing, really important work underlying the reply brief appellee brief that we filed in the 8th Circuit. A lot of her work was, I think, really important, and I think is going to be really important. What I hope is going to be a successful litigation and over the appeal.
Great. All right. And Fonda, the extraordinary Fonda, has been popping things into the chat box. So if anyone's interested in the Intercept article about Tiger Swan or about the students working on this team, you can find it all in the chat box. Noah, it's been great working with you. It's been important, and you are an amazing lead counsel, I can just say.
Thank you so much for having me here. I think these things are really important to talk about, and this is it's been a great event so far, and I'm really excited to see where things go. So no, thank you for putting this together.
Yeah, thanks. So we're going to turn now. First of all, I want to send a big shout out and big thanks to Iron Bull Singers. I know that there were some. There we go. You're back. Thanks so much. We really appreciated you sharing those 2 songs with us. And so now we're going to kind of ask Alyssa, another one of our panelists, to present. Alyssa has written really about the connection between the Water for Life movement and the repression and the policing and the importance of this, of thinking about this through the lens of abolition democracy. So I'm going to turn it over now to Alyssa to kick us off, but I really want to thank you all Iron Bull Singers for joining us, and invite you to hang on, listen, and participate as much as you'd like, okay? Thanks so much. Thank you so much. Okay. Alyssa, do you want to go ahead and present?
Yes, I can go ahead. So first of all, I just also want to thank Iron Bull Singers for an amazing performance. It was really great, and I really appreciate it. And I'm really glad to be here. So thank you for the invitation. And What my blog post tried to get at was something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is, I guess I would put it as sort of the struggle with and against the state, or how to use the state in the project of abolishing oil and taking on fossil capital. Because in the book I wrote on the Green New Deal, or co-wrote on the Green New Deal, we were trying to envision what a radical Green New Deal could look like, one that I think could in many ways realize aspects of the promise of Du Bois's abolition democracy, to build a racially and economically just society. But the problem is that the state that we want to deliver the Green New Deal, to build public housing, to build green transit with union labor, this is the state which also is presently criminalizing, incarcerating, and policing. And that state has not shown a lot of interest in this project of abolishing oil, or abolishing what we could call fossil capital, following Andreas Malm's work on the transition to coal power, but which I think also applies to thinking about oil and gas. There's this moment at the end of Reinhold's blog post where he reminds us of the moment where Trump threatened that Biden wanted to abolish the suburbs. And it's like one of many, if only, moments that I remember during the presidential campaign, where you're sort of like, yeah, I wish that would happen. And it reminded me of something that Trump had also said about oil, because in one of the last presidential debates, Trump had tweeted Biden, I think, said, like, we have to transition away from fossil fuels. And Trump tweeted, Biden wants to abolish the entire US oil industry. That means no fracking, no jobs, no energy for Pennsylvania families, obviously trying to flip Pennsylvania or to win Pennsylvania in the election. And Biden immediately said, we're not getting rid of fossil fuels. We're getting rid of subsidies for fossil fuels, but we're not getting rid of fossil fuels for a long time. And that, I feel like, is representative of sort of the place we're in a lot, where we have even these candidates who are proposing, a big green jobs program or something like that, are also, with the other hand, saying, no, we're not going to get rid of fossil fuels. But of course, we have to get rid of fossil fuels. He was right the first time. We have to get rid of more than subsidies. We have to abolish oil, as Reinhold's post or essay that we started off with puts it, and to do that means abolishing a lot of very valuable assets, or to not digging up and burning a lot of fossil fuel companies' very valuable oil reserves. We can only burn about 1/12 of known fossil fuel reserves if we're going to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, which is the kind of 1.5 to stay alive, being like the chan of small island states. I think we're already kind of in a danger zone at less than 1.5 right now. So obviously we want to keep it below that. I think that just goes to the need to talk about, when we talk about abolishing oil, certainly abolishing many of the sort of aspects of our social world built around oil that Reinhold talks about, but also about what that means in terms of taking on capital, and fossil capital in particular. And I do find heartening this year has been a very tough year for oil. So I actually think this is a very important moment to be making that push. The collapse in our usual patterns of life led to this huge crash on oil use and oil prices. Oil demand dropped about 9% over the course of the year. Although in some ways it's kind of striking that it only dropped 9% despite this huge disruption of daily life. I think that really suggests the degree to which oil is embedded in so much of the structures of our lives, our economy, the way things, goods move around the world, many of the things that Reinhold points out. But it's still been a devastating year for US oil producers, many of which were sort of pumped up by cheap credit after 2008. Fracking is really the product of access to cheap credit after the 2008 financial crash, and it has produced this big glut. Anyway, so the U.S. fossil fuel industry is not in good shape, and so I think we're in a really important moment to take on what a very powerful industry that has seemed almost too powerful to do anything with. and around this time last year, I think somebody pointed out that the U.S. government could buy out like the four biggest oil producers in the country for about $300 billion, which is now looks very cheap compared to many of the stimulus monies we've been seeing, and put them on a managed decline. That obviously didn't happen. We've seen a lot of, if you read the Financial Times every day, it seems like renewable energy is going to abolish oil as part of this this churn of creative destruction. Green finance is coming in, oil is on the way out. But I just think, there are many signs that oil is struggling, but those are not, we can't count on any of those to actually do the work of putting an end to oil and to the oil infrastructures that are going to continue to extract and burn these fuels for a really long time to come. Under the Obama administration, we saw this huge growth in renewable energy build out, but not but also the U.S. became a major oil producer and oil exporter. So, this is why I think it's really essential to be thinking about not only sort of like the building out of renewable energy and all of the things that we want to be doing, but also that struggle to shut down the fossil fuel industry, to stop it, to stop the production of new fossil fuel extraction sites and the infrastructure for transporting those fuels around. And that is, that has just been led by indigenous movements in particular, and the climate movement mostly against pipelines in North America, but around the world also against other sites of extraction. And that, there have been many, and I think incredible effects of that already. Like, I think those movements have rejuvenated the U.S. climate movement and really radicalized the U.S. climate movement. I think they are, it's unimaginable to me to think of the sort of swell of like government decarbonization statements, financial institution divestment statements, all of these things without that, without those movements. They've actually put an end to pipeline projects, of course, both through compelling the state to deny construction permits, and also in some cases by just raising the cost of building the pipeline so that they're not viable, by tying them up in legal challenges. So, there's been, we've seen these, like, I think really incredible, there have been really incredible effects of these movements, but it's come at a really serious cost in terms of repression, in terms of people. I think, Standing Rock is obviously sort of the zenith of this, where we saw, really a militarization of the reservation, as Noah just described, the sort of roadblocks. And mentioned the police brutality, which I think did get much more attention, and also certainly rightfully so. Police from 7 states beat and maced and tased people under a law. The sheriff called in people from, or called in law enforcement from 6 states other than North Dakota, under a law called the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which was supposed to be a natural disaster law, but was also invoked in response to the Baltimore uprising after Freddie Gray's murder. So has been, it's one of these sort of laws made for other purposes, but that has been used to repress protest. The police obviously eventually demolished that protest site. The Dakota Access Pipeline was unfortunately built. It's been sort of, it has been transporting oil, but has been recently shut down again. But I think, that really, I think, points to just the necessity. Not only Standing Rock, many other, in general, I think, move to criminalize protests against, certainly against fossil fuel infrastructure, but also like a now 30-year move to really shut down all kinds of environmental protests under the banner of like eco-terrorism, environmental terrorism, going back to the 90s, and that are used, that and then of course sort of that coming at also a longer heritage of repression of Black and Indigenous and Latino movements. Some of the Green Scare stuff, as I wrote in my blog post, Jaws and COINTELPRO. So, you know, I think it's just that is where the fight to abolish oil is happening, and where the sort of fossil capitalist state is pushing back in ways. And that I think we really have to be, you know, climate movements have to be taking that as a piece of the struggle and fighting, if fighting not only the expansion of fossil fuel extraction infrastructure, but also against the forces that would sort of that are trying to make the world safe for fossil capital rather than for people. So yeah, do you have a?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And in the post, the way that you kind of connect the dots and the triangle that is formed here. And one of the things that is always stunning, Standing Rock, so many different aspects of Standing Rock exemplify precisely what you're talking about in terms of the connections, right? I mean, obviously it's not just Standing Rock, there are other pipelines, but so much of what happened at Standing Rock exemplifies perfectly this connection that you're talking about, particularly, right, the fact that, you know, the pipeline was originally supposed to go near Bismarck, right? And it was kind of white people in Bismarck who said, we don't want this, right? And that's what made it move down to Standing Rock, to the vicinity of Standing Rock, right? That alone, right? That fact alone shows the ways in which you can't think about issues of fossil fuels and pipelines and oil separate from abolition democracy, in a sense, right? It was the white people in Bismarck who didn't want this, and they don't want this. They don't want this to pollute their waters and whatnot. And then it gets shafted onto Standing Rock, right? That combined with the way in which then the pipeline hires basically a counterinsurgency private security firm, the Tiger Swan. I mean, Tiger Swan was born in Iraq. I mean, it was a U.S. private security firm that kind of got learned its lessons in Iraq, and of course in the Intercept piece that we flipped into the chat box, which goes through these documents, internal documents that were ultimately kind of leaked and to the Intercept. It's clear that the logic of the counterinsurgency warfare, which was used, which would have been used kind of by Tiger Swan when it was in the field in Iraq, was just kind of like laid on top of the movement for water, right? So the water protectors were called jihadists in the internal documents, and of course many of the classic counterinsurgency tactics were deployed in terms of also kind of fomenting dissent, et cetera, the same kind of practices that were used against, the Black Panthers in the 60s. So, I mean, that moment brings together, it seems, and as you talk about in your essay, brings together so perfectly the way in which one can't imagine dealing with issues of extractive capitalism without dealing with the issues of racial justice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a lot of other ways we could also connect that. There's so many directions it goes. You could think about, like, I was also thinking, and over the past week about, the use of incarcerated people to fight wildfires in California, which are obviously intensifying every year as they have drier summers and more kindling because of changing climate patterns. Anyway, so obviously we have this intensified like fire season in the West that that incarcerated people are fighting them for $1 an hour. There's obviously a huge amount of work on environmental justice and the impacts of pollution of things like oil refineries in like Philadelphia or Richmond, California, on communities of color in particular. There's so many connections to it, I think. although one other thing that came up as you were talking about the other connections to Standing Rock and the sort of this counterinsurgency from Iraq connection, I think it also reminds me of the a sort of longer history of or I guess a different, not only longer, but like in a slightly different direction, which is repression of actually fossil fuel workers movements, where actually against the Keystone Pipeline struggle that started a few years before Standing Rock. Most unions, there's obviously been kind of a real struggle with labor around these pipelines, but one of the unions that did actually support Keystone, the anti-Keystone protesters, was the Amalgamated Transit Workers Union. And they said, they were like the repression of these protesters reminds us of like the use of Pinkerton to bust unions and the use of these private security forces to suppress people who are struggling against these companies. And I think that's a really important connection. I mean, in the 20th century, so many of the most deadly labor struggles were actually led by coal miners, where the state comes in and shuts down and kills like union organizers. And now we have a much, there's this complicated relationship to, I think, extractive industry workers, coal and oil workers. And they definitely, a lot of pipeline workers said really important things about Standing Rock protesters. Leona called them thugs, so there are complicated things there, but I think there's also a history within, of workers not seeing those companies as like their benefactors, but as their enemies, and also struggling against that repression. So there are a lot of different, I think, important places to think about where that struggle against both private and public coercive power can take us in the fight to abolish oil and fight for an abolition democracy of abolishing oil.
Right. Yeah. And some of these make me think, particularly Reinhold, of the connections to the New Deal, which is really central to your text, and which maybe we can get to shortly.
Yeah, since you mentioned that, and I just wanted to,
yes,
the book that Alyssa co-authored with Kate Aronoff, Daniela Cohen, and Thea Riofrancos that you mentioned. It's called A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal. And so in that book too, you'll read, there's a kind of historical dimension to this, attempts to recover, the Socialist International in some respect around housing and other matters related to public works, but at the same time recognize their contradictions and articulate these histories with present struggles, as Alyssa just described. So I do think that that's very important. The New Deal, in that sense, should be taken seriously as part of the historical context, but not exclusively. It's also important to remember that Du Bois wrote Black Reconstruction during the New Deal era.
Right. Right. Published in 1935, so it was smack in. It was in
part of that.
It's exactly of the discrimination, also in terms of Black workers, white workers, exclusion from white unions, etc. Yeah.
Very much.
Daniela, I know it's now 1:15 a.m. for you on Friday morning. So why don't we, and so I know that you prepared something for us. So why don't you take it away? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I just want to first also say my thanks to you, Bernard, for inviting me. It's true. I can't believe it's the 6th iteration. I'm still caught in the Nietzsche somewhere. It really is a great honor to be part of this conversation. And also to my co-panelists, from whose work I have really learned a tremendous amount during the last few weeks, and to Fonda for basically responding immediately to every anxious email I had. So as Bernard said, I have pre-recorded my talk because it is late, and the later the hour, the greater the chance that I fall into German. So to prevent that, it is pre-recorded, and I really, really want to thank my colleague and collaborator Suleika Ayub for thinking with me and for actually designing and producing this video. I'm not sure what was more work, so many thanks. Maybe Fonda, if you...
Fonda's gonna play the video. I think maybe we should all turn off our videos and then come on the minute it's over, okay? All right,
Okay.
and thanks Fonda for sharing that video.
Energy and injustices are entangled, informing not only the conditions for forms of government, but also racism, colonialism, and I would add fascisms. Scholars across fields have importantly demonstrated that addressing these injustices requires a practice of critical investigation. Shalanda Baker, for example, reworks the concept of resilience and shows how such intervention matters for decolonizing the energy system and creating the possibilities for an anti-racist approach to energy policy. In questioning the Gaia concept, which serves yet another theory of natural resilience, Leah Aronowsky reveals how science and capitalism are often complicit. Timothy Mitchell exposes the inextricability of coal, colonization, and industrialization, while Benjamin Sovacool points out that imperialism and colonialism were also part of an era of renewable energy and associated technologies, from wind-powered sailboats to windmills grounding sugarcane on slave plantations. This is emphasized also by Reinhold Martin's important caution that there is no guarantee that today's oil wars will not be replaced by tomorrow's solar wars or wind wars. And indeed, while we have not managed to get rid of Chevron and ExxonMobil, there's already Elon Musk in his endeavors to further capitalize on solar, electrical, and nuclear energy in order to facilitate colonization not only on Earth but in outer space. Frederick Jackson Turner's famous prognosis, according to which American energy will continually demand a wider field of its exercise, resonates eerily, yet not surprisingly. What can we do, having landed here, at universities, sites of creative yet exclusive knowledge production where thinking, even if erroneously considered an abstract practice, takes and has taken, often even violently and forcefully, energy? Where to put our energy as researchers in order to challenge injustices and contribute to different modes of mattering in and of the world? Not only does thinking and knowledge production take energy, the practice of critical thought too is, one way or the other, attracted to power, as an object of analysis and critique, as that which bears the potential to undo or redirect thought, and as that which makes certain modes of existence possible and prevents others from coming into being. Concepts are, of course, never simply conceptual. They are entangled and of the world, singular in their specificity and at the same time multiple. And if concepts attract, they matter. Undoubtedly, the question of what a concept can do in the world is one of force. Or is it energy? Even onto-epistemologically, the distinction is by no means clear-cut, neither in terms of the phenomena they either express or represent, nor in terms of their entanglements with the social-political conditions of existence. David Hume has pointedly remarked that there are hardly any ideas that are more obscure and uncertain as those of power, force, and energy, an observation that has been shared not only by philosophers and social political scientists, but also by physicists throughout time. Among them, Bertrand Russell, who in his ABC of Relativity from 1925 argued in a chapter titled The Abolition of Force that the Newtonian concept of force, with its notions of cause and effect, action and reaction, does not coincide with the physical world and serves as a convenient shorthand for certain purposes. Purposes that, we can infer, do not exclusively pertain to the realm of physics, as he argues that a shift in the notion of force would not only alter people's physical imagination, but also their morals and politics. Russell concludes his chapter by asking, and what about matter? Is matter also no more than a convenient shorthand? I will return to this question shortly when attending to Latour and his proposal of a mode of sense-making which allegedly bears immense political energy. Let me first clarify that what I will be arguing here by attending to matters of energy injustices is that rather than representational modes of sense-making that are uncritical of their underlying onto-epistemological assumptions, such as the Cartesian dualism, we need practices of critical inquiry that understand a concept not as an idea, but as being of the world, coming from, mattering forth, as a phenomenon, an entire entangled space-time mattering of particular kinds of configurations and not others. Energy is neither exclusively physical nor solely social-political. It is not one. It matters differently for differently entangled bodies, depending on the specific historical, legal, social, but also physical entanglements. Energy is a metaphorical expression. Keeping with representational thought necessarily reduces concepts to an epistemological concern. The question of what the world is, and as Karen Barat critically points out, what and how ontology is, has been decided once and for all. Such a mode of inquiry, I argue, is precisely what upholds the theory-praxis separation, as it understands theory as detached from, praxis in, but unfortunately neither as of the world. Let me give you two examples. Latour's down-to-earth does not escape representational thought, for despite his articulation of what he terms the terrestrial, the structure of his argument remains dualist and his thought metaphorical, even if his metaphors denote material matter such as attraction, weight, or magnetic mass. What is more, his call for different forms of belonging are contingent on an atomistic worldview, reducing relationality to action and reaction, attraction and repulsion, which also is what enables the questionable revival of a wicked universalism, the idea of a shared universal human condition that has been part of the core conceptual repertoire of European Enlightenment and social contract thought. What matters is universal, yet cannot be everything. A list has to be made, but the gap itself is not to be discussed. Terrestrial conflicts, political concepts, and scientific questions have to be broadened and limited in their investigative reach. It is the critical zone, Latour claims, that should serve as a point of return and departure for sciences that matter to us. All that concerns us resides in this minuscule zone. Latour calls on his reader to be rational and material, yet he himself not only omits to mention what matter is, he even excludes the very question from our field of scientific and philosophical attention. That it is indeed dangerous to assume that we already know what matter is, or to leave it up to others to reconceptualize, has been and is continuously demonstrated, including by the splitting of atomic nuclei. Situating onto epistemological questions such as, but not only, what matter is and means, categorically outside the field of critical, political, and scientific attention, and at the same time assuming that we can nevertheless responsibly rethink terrestrial conflicts, find ways to exist differently with the world, and claim a universal human condition seems paradoxical, to say the least. How are we, in this account, to understand who and what will matter when this immense political energy is released? Without doubt, with nuclear fission and global warming, a particular kind of awareness of the fact that the world matters increased. Old questions of justice arose anew. It is worth taking a quick look into yet another attempt to respond to the injustices that global warming and energy systems, now called the bond to be cleaner, greener, fairer, and more accessible, brought about. In legal scholarship, which has become more attentive to thinking law in relation to both social and natural science, contemplations of how to share the world, an inherently legal question by the way, has resulted in the emergence of a concept and field called energy justice, which is described as a conceptual tool for uniting justice concerns, an analytical tool for energy researchers to understand values embedded in energy systems, and a decision-making tool for energy policy makers. It focuses on an analysis of the burdens and benefits of the energy system, as well as on more inclusive policy-making processes. And yet, despite the interdisciplinary nature of the endeavor, the important potential for addressing energy injustices, the increasingly more critical approaches, and the strong emphasis on praxis, the very concept of energy justice has been mainly discussed and defined by a rather small group of scholars, and this matters. Take, for example, Jenkins, Hevron, and Macaulay, who argue that the aim of energy justice is to apply energy principles to energy policy, production, systems, consumption, activism, security, and to climate change. Energy, it is argued, denotes specific energy systems, which is why energy justice as a concept has to be differentiated from the concepts of climate and environmental justice. The latter, these scholars argue, are discursively too diverse, influenced by their activist past, and are lacking a clear definition of justice. It is precisely this conceptual purity, a more solid and lasting foundation to the concept's core meaning and value, that is supposed to enable a transfer of the concept from the educational or academic sphere into practice, making it relevant for law and policy making and ensuring equality. In other words, while practices on the ground may vary, and while energy justice is meant to attend to different energy injustices, what and how the concept means, what and how energy and justice mean, at least according to significant parts of energy justice scholarship, has to be clear, definable, and eventually applicable to injustices and modes of existence that might even be incommensurable with the structures, histories, and modes of thought that brought the very concept into existence. What both examples, Latour's down-to-earth and the mentioned energy justice scholarship, show by trying to revive notions of universality and by determining the reach and focus of scientific, legal, and philosophical sense-making, is the challenge of finding modes of thinking and investigating that can address energy injustices in their entanglements across scales, spatialities, and temporalities. It is precisely this challenge, although approached differently, that the Logische Fantasie Lab, a research agency co-directed by Patricia Williams, Suleika Ayub, and myself, aims to address. In its metaphorical investigations into onto-epistemological concepts such as breathing, criminal organization, or critical contact zones, which eventually provide the ground for law and policy making, it takes seriously that the practice of making sense with the world requires an ongoing commitment of being response-able to what matters, to the possibilities and impossibilities of different modes of existence. It requires collaborations across disciplines and fields of knowledge production, including non-academic ones, and an ethics of objectivity that does not separate research, theories, laws, concepts, and meaning from how they matter in their specificity. The gas exchanges and the right to breathe investigation, for example, attends to breathing injustices from various different entry points, exposing that the universal idea of breathing, argued for example as a matter of air quality and measured according to agreed upon parameters, cannot attend to the injustices inscribed into the matters of legal, economic, societal, and political systems. What does it mean to breathe?
The this narrative that is bigger than the force field of violence.
Breathing is not universal. Once we realize that law must respond to matter, this is what metaphorical method is best able to speak to.
Radioactive colonialism permeates all of these scales and matters, from the cellular through to the planetary.
You know, these rights are often articulated in the abstract.
The investigation takes seriously that what breathing means depends on its specific entanglements, and that this has major consequences for how we imagine and construct a right to breathe. How does law measure when and how force, far from being simply a legal or social construct, becomes unreasonable? How can legal logic make sense of the temporalities of cancerous cell reproduction and the colonization of both lifetimes and half-lifetimes over decades, even centuries, in the aftermath of the Trinity test? And how to break legal thought free from representationalism, which determines that what is rendered unrepresentable does not matter, be it viral particles, various forms of toxicity, or even modes of existence. Such are the questions the LOFI researchers are encountering in their investigations into a right to breathe that can't be response-able to breathing injustices, including those hitherto not only unrecognized, but unrecognizable by our very modes of sense and consequently law and policy making. Challenging power and powers requires different collaborations and concepts of relationality. It takes time and energy. Breathing too is a matter of energy and justice, not only in regard to gas exchanges or air pollution, but also toxic waste, environmental racism, police violence, and extractivist capitalism. Keeping with capitalist energy also means keeping with its logic and reason, continuously expanding not only its field of exercise, but also the condition of unbreathability. In case of oxygen scarcity in the early days of Mars, as we read in space literature, those unable to afford oxygen produced by privately owned factories might be put on an oxygen diet. For law and legal thought, this will not be a stretch. Besides, as Musk said, law should be kept short anyway. It is yet again all about energy. On Mars, once a breathable atmosphere has been created, perhaps even before, it should be easier to remove a law than create one, because things just get to inertia and you have to have something that's gonna overcome inertia.
Thank you, Daniela, for your intervention. Thanks so much. And yeah, everyone, I want to invite everyone back on. And thanks so much for kind of connecting, particularly Leah Aronowsky's piece on gas guzzling Gaia, which Leah is actually with us. And so we're going to find a way to turn the video on. But also the Bruno Latour of Down to Earth. And you know, Alyssa had also written or had started to take on the new book, suis-je, Lessons on the Confinement, with some critique. So we'll get to that in a minute. I know, Reinhold, you wanted to jump in on this intervention, though.
Yeah, no, first of all, thanks everyone, Alyssa, Daniela, for continuing, basically building out, I think, different aspects of this conversation that will be our shared challenge to, connect or reconnect. And just quickly for Daniela, before I also have some thoughts to share about other dimensions of connection, but while we're thinking with Daniela about air in particular, so I come from the spatial sciences, we could say, to some extent. And the concept of space and a politics of space has been understood as central to the production of space with Lefebvre, or indeed with our friend Michel Foucault, with whom we began this whole series 6 years ago. Such politics are central. So So what happens when we substitute air? I mean, if we can put it that way, when what we used to call space, we now call air. What else do you think maybe might change?
Actually, there is one of the researchers is, it's not really working on air, but on some of the constituents. See, it's happening of air, namely oxygen, and he's trying to trace the whole history of oxygen, but not only as a gas and not only as a chemical element, but also in its materiality, in how various concepts like social contract concepts were not thinking with oxygen and consequently not with air. And there's a lot of work also done trying to think with air. I think that it goes further to understanding whatever terms and concepts we use in a metaphorical way, and understanding how with speaking with Karen Barat, everything is entangled, which also means that there's no outside observer, and there's not, some air, and we're just part of it. So I think this is good, but still I do think that what my work is concerned with, or actually I should say the work of the researchers more who were doing that work, is really understanding what our modes of thought are and where the violences are. So even, thinking with air would mean to not think of air as any kind of property, not think of air as something giving, not thinking of space. And I think there actually you might know way more as something that's already a given container. If that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I think we can pick that up along different lines in a minute, but I'll see if Bernard has further.
Well, I don't know, Alyssa, if you wanted to jump in, particularly maybe on the Latour.
I mean, I have some. I'm happy to jump in with also at Latour, but if Reinhold wants to go ahead.
Well, Reinhold's going to kind of present next, or kind of try and bring things together somewhat, and in part back to the New Deal. So I don't know if you wanted to say something about the Latour and the change in the Latour from the earlier book to the next one.
Yeah, I suppose what I'd say about that is it seems like if anything, I was surprised in reading Down to Earth that Latour seemed to be taking a different tack than he often has, and in some ways Daniela's presentation makes me wonder if I'm right about that, because of course, as you point out, he also is repeating many of the same moves, both in terms of his analysis of his ontological analysis, but also his sort of use of the Schmittian friend-enemy distinction. A lot of the same, there are many similar tropes in Down to Earth, but I was struck by it as what felt like more of a political intervention into sort of a contemporary political world than Latour often seems to make. He often writes about politics and power as imbued within scientific practice and many kinds of relationships, but not as, not a book that's about rising populism, which is really what a lot of the driving force of Down to Earth is. So that was, I found that interesting. And I think insofar as as I said in my piece, I do want us to name, I don't know if I don't want to endorse the sort of friend-enemy distinction per se, but I do want us to name some enemies, and I think that we should be naming some of the enemies that like oil companies, the fossil fuel industry, and seeing how significant those are. And Leah Aronowsky's piece really shows how fundamentally they have shaped not only the systems of the world that we live in, but also our understandings of our world, of our planet, in funding Lovelock Sky research. So, there was something exciting to me about seeing Latour at least sort of dip a toe in a more combative vein. But in a way, maybe I'll retract some of that in light of Daniela's emphasis on the ways in which he retains much of the core of maybe some things we want to question about other aspects of his work. And this is, I think, one of the themes of Leah Aronowsky's piece too, is that there's that we really should be questioning some of the concepts that have been so central to Latour, if their origin is in this basically PR strategy for Royal Dutch Shell and other oil companies. So, but we can talk about that more, and it would be great to get Leah in the conversation too. So I'll let, unless Daniela, if you want to say anything else in response, I'd be really curious, but I'm also happy to go over to Reinhold.
Daniela, did you want to add anything there?
We can also speak about that later, so, and whatever you prefer.
Okay. Yeah, the only, before we turn to Reinhold, the only thought I was thinking, in particularly in the new book, the turn to the termite and the place of the termite really reminded me a lot of Donna Haraway and the Strugel scene in that book. And so I'm curious to see what else there is there in terms of those relations. But Reinhold, why don't you go ahead and help us think about this, bringing us back to Standing Rock, about bringing us back to the New Deal and the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Green New Deal and energy justice, etc.
Well, let's see what we can do. I'm not sure that all of the above will make it into my little kind of mental outline here in order to maybe help myself as well as all of us here sort through some the kind of amazingly rich thought that is already on the table, so to speak. And I do agree that metaphorically speaking, to borrow Daniela's term, Bruno Latour is the elephant in the room. He's the metaphorical elephant in the room. But also, to borrow one of a kind of Latourianism, it may be time to deflate the elephant a little bit. Latour methodologically will speak especially in his kind of descriptive mode of a deflationary relation with intellectual traditions and thought and paradigms and so on. And as part of like bringing things down to earth, and it may be now necessary, and again, I will add to the celebration of Leah Aronowsky's piece, which I really think is crucial, and very happy to see it out now in Critical Inquiry. Leah also gave a very nice presentation, a talk on that. If anybody wants to see it in video form, I think on the Society of Fellows website, I will put a plug for that. But the point is that terms like Gaia and this kind of placeholders that intellectuals develop for the complexities that we try to work through, either in our empirical work or in our theoretical work, do a certain amount of work in and of themselves, but it sometimes get in the way. And my sense is that to some extent, the Latourian paradigm is I'm not, needs a little bringing down to earth. Okay, so just to say first that as I said initially, that as a kind of practitioner to some extent of the spatial sciences, an affiliate of the design arts, I'm speaking about myself, and a practitioner of the historical sciences, I wanted to situate a little bit my own, both the pieces that you folks were kind enough to read and help me think about, and all of us interpret, and but also within this larger conversation that we're part of. Why? Because actually, I think since day one, I don't know if Bernard would agree, but to me, one of the questions that this series has posed, since the 1313 Foucault, was the question of the intellectual and of intellectuals, who we are, if that's what some of us or all of us may be, and what are our, as such, responsibilities. Foucault himself, and I think, in fact, we just saw with Noah and Bernard, the exchange that you both had with Iron Bull, and the work that you're doing, I think, is exemplary and in parallel with the kind of work that Foucault did with Giff and so on, using the tools of the university, of the academy, in the interests of furthering the cause of justice. And so, but Foucault had this kind of idea of the specific intellectual, right? That we use the tools that we know best. In some way, in a sense, I've always thought about this as kind of turning expertise on its head. The things that people get tenure for and all that, turn it upside down and put it to use in a practical way, but a way that is theoretically consistent. And so I think that's how I like to think about what we're doing. And therefore, there's a lot of translation that needs to, with or without the help of Gaia and these other kind of common idioms that we might need to do across some of this discourse. So I have let's see if we can get through 4 different little points, bullet points, more or less, from the conversation. I'll spare you too much historical detail or any of that. I can discuss that in conversation. But to bring us back to Standing Rock to begin with, and to the discussion that you began with Noah and with the Iron Bull group and what they were doing. So what happened there? Well, many things, obviously, but one of the things that clearly happened there was that a road was closed. And for we who work with space, is one reason I asked you about that, and something happened spatially. A road was closed. A way to think about this is that a line was cut. For some, maybe even a lifeline, but certainly a line of everyday life, of sociability, of coming and going. And again, you heard in the lawsuit seems to be essentially about the cutting of that line and the injustice thus done. That line was cut in response to an effort to cut or interrupt another line, a pipeline, and so on and so on. And so there's one thing that we can do with lines. We can either make them or break them. But when we do that, we can maybe think about doing, this is the sort of second point, of doing this in 2 different directions, so to speak. And a kind of rubric under which it might be useful to think about this would be a sort of politics of infrastructure. Because of course, in the Standing Rock case, we're talking about highways and pipelines, but also waterways. And the land through which all of these pass, and the property lines and the lines that demarcate territory and so on, that we can also describe as infrastructural. So kind of against that background, think about these 2 types of lines. And this, I tried to elaborate on this in the addendum blog post that I put up for the session. But just more generically, that we can think about lines as boundaries, lines that separate things, or fences, or as axes, as lines that connect, like roads or pipelines. And so the politics of these 2 different directions are a little bit different. The friend-enemy relation, for example, is mediated differently on either side of a boundary, like a fence or a checkpoint or something like that, than it may be on the road that was occupied at Standing Rock. So, then to add, as I tried to say in the post, a kind of to extend the problem of lines in the 3 directions that I suggested, which are borrowed from various discourses that are coming together in the entangled, kind of world that we're trying to sort through right now, which would be the discourses of environmental justice, basically, to which I think the struggle at Standing Rock and Keystone and so on roughly belong. Climate justice, which is related but not exactly the same. A politics of air, for example, of carbonization and decarbonization, which is less immediately felt, typically. And this is hence one of the problems than the toxicity in the water or other aspects of environmental justice. And then finally, the color line, Du Bois's color line, which Du Bois in 1900 said to the Pan-African Congress in London would be, quite prophetically, the problem of the 20th century. And indeed, he was more right than perhaps even he was willing to consider, or at least to hope. And of course, all of this is carried into our century. So how to think about these problems productively and in a manner that in a sense balances what might be different and maybe even, if not antithetical, at least hypothetically, if we extend them to the logical conclusions, different propositions that are on the table. So for example, the challenge to dualism that Daniela mentioned, and that Latour in his own way, as everybody has said, is somewhat contradictorily mounted. I think this is also implicit in Leah's article. To in a way, in some sense, erase the line, or at least render it in a different way, recognize the way in the twists and turns, a topology that is more complicated than simple friend enemy or this and that, us and them. On the other hand, we have, as Alyssa said, the problem and maybe the necessity, and here I would certainly agree, of naming the enemy. There are times, it seems to me, when we must simply say no and stand on one side of the line, as I think we are doing now with Iron Bull and their colleagues at Standing Rock, metaphorically speaking, if I can borrow that. But it's not on the side of the police or of the state in that sense. And yet there are times, again, as Alyssa said, when we may be called upon, and this is how I do read, and you said it, I think, very well, the proposition of the radical Green New Deal, as outlined in your book and in many others, and even somebody like Nick Estes and his work as it passes through the Red Deal towards the Green New Deal. Many others kind of speaks somewhat in this language that the problem of working both with and against the state, which has also been a theme over the years, which including the Nietzsche moment. I mean, there was nobody more kind of angry, shall we say, about the German state, and at the same time over-identified with the German folk in tragic and problematic ways than someone like Nietzsche. So, I mean, these are sort of philosophical questions that hit the ground in very concrete ways that we can see here. A last thing to point to make about this is the use, I mean, to me, profoundly troubling, of emergency powers. This is kind of, in a sense, the Schmittian ghosts come to haunt us yet again, but of emergency powers in and around the climate crisis. So among the calls of the climate movement, and particularly it's more radical, but this has become more mainstream now, is to declare a state of emergency. Because after all, it is an emergency. And yet we do understand what that could entail. And this is why it's possible that there may yet be solar wars and wind wars in a manner that unfortunately recapitulates some of the problems we're trying to avoid. Anyway, so finally, that just brings me back to this problem that I tried to open up a little bit in the conversation just now with Daniela, in which I think it is plausible to say, at least I would make the claim, that something like a still modernist politics of space must be now at least supplemented, if not displaced, decentered, maybe even provincialized, by something like a politics of air and other, matter in all the senses in which the term resonates. But I do think that doesn't, resolve, to some extent, it problematizes some of the, it amplifies some of the problems that I've just tried to lay out. That as we've learned terribly, and as you reminded us in the case of George Floyd and so many others, that the right to breathe is being violated as we speak day to day in all kinds of ways. And lines are being drawn in space, but also in the law and in the many media in which we do our work and in which our society does its work of producing order, that that separate those who are free to breathe, in a sense, from those for whom that is made more difficult. And this is a kind of, in a way, truism of environmental justice, that the location of polluting toxic sites is racialized. It's been racialized since day one, and it does, and these histories tend to repeat. I tried to show how even and very importantly, I think, because I think we have to deal with these contradictions, an emancipatory project is the most progressive wing of the New Deal was still burdened by the whites only water fountains that they literally produced and reproduced, as well as the many other racial injustices that were written into those policies and so on. So again, there's much more to discuss along those lines, so to speak, but I think I will leave it there maybe and see if we can open up for a kind of conversation, again, with gratitude to everyone for their thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Reinhold, and thanks for really connecting to Daniela directly in terms of the right to breathe, which is part of one of your research projects, which really does tie together in another seamless way the relationship between abolition democracy and the struggles with climate. How metaphorical, Daniela, and I also want to welcome Leah, who's here with us as well. And actually, since it's 8, I want to welcome all of our graduate students to please join us and kind of come on the video, and you can wave to me when you want to ask questions. People can also put questions in the Q&A if you'd like to. And we can also, and also just send it quickly, just send a little text in the chat box to Fonda, and she can get you so that you can turn on your video. So I see that Zailuka Ayub has an extraordinary question. So, but I'd like to, it would be better if we could hear it live. So please just click to Fonda in the chat and she will find the device that will make you come on live on the video, please. Daniela, just one quick thought about the, about the right to breathe in response in part to what Reinhold was suggesting, but also as a way to really connect these different struggles, right? How metaphorical, how legal does it become?
I think this is a very important question, and also what Reinhold, if I may, said. I think it's precisely about this lines, or as I said, Karen Barat speaks of cuts that cut together apart. Deleuze tried to express it with becomings. Whitehead tried to express it with events, and these are just a few of the more canonized works that I know, and I bet there are way more. But I think the question about cuts that cut into dualisms, into dichotomies, into two sides, this is precisely, going back to Descartes, also how law works too. So it works with inclusion and exclusion, applicability, non-applicability. And I know also, Bernard, I know this is not that easy at the end of the day, but the very mode of functioning is such. So one of the questions for me, and I think that Reinhold, the idea of working with air and a politics of air, or whatever this might mean, or materialities or gas exchange or whatever, I think can be very useful, because one of the things, in order to address a right to breathe that's not universal, and usually I think we think that universal is good because it means like everyone has a right to breathe, but it also means that you need a definition, you need parameters, you need analogies, you need comparisons, and a lot is rendered negligible by doing so. And if you would add that up, then what is the right to breathe if only what fits into these descriptions, which are made by language, can be a right to breathe. So I do think that finding ways of thinking in non-dualist ways, and yet, being able to think singularities. Like, for example, I mean, we do need to, there has to be a law that protects the right to breathe of George Floyd or Barbara Dawson. No question, I think. But also there has to be, I think, a notion of law that does not work with the ever same modes of exclusions. And I think that what you said, also in terms of your field of engagement, is very, very important.
Great. Now, I want to give Leah an opportunity to jump in, because you've been interpolated at a number of moments in the conversation. So I just want to give you an opportunity to jump in. We all read your piece in Critical Inquiry, brilliantly tracing how the discourse of Gaia was created. And so that's been a really important piece for us as we've been thinking about all of this. So Leah, let me give you a moment, and then I see Zuleika has joined us and has a question, and then I see Ivan Nicholas as well. So Leah?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I feel like an interloper of sorts. Abolition is not my immediate concern, but I'm happy to talk about what I think history of science as a methodological inquiry could add to the conversation. So the piece is about the Gaia hypothesis, which has been a very influential idea in certain realms of climate science, but it turns out to have these oil and gas origins. And so part of the project was about teasing out that relationship of Shell and the progenitor of the hypothesis, James Lovelock. But really what I'm more interested in that piece, and what I think can be useful to put on the table, is thinking about the ways in which the interests of capital, fossil capital, can operate at the level of epistemology, and scientific epistemology in particular. So thinking about how introducing this idea of a self-regulating, homeostatic Gaian system, how that sort of becomes an epistemological program that directs scientific attention onto certain questions, as in, so in the case of Gaia, what is the role of the non-human in producing climate change, rather than, it acts as a sort of diversionary practice. So I'm really interested in my own work in just thinking about how epistemology and how science really can function in this system, even if we're not thinking in a sort of conspiratorial way, but just at the level of sort of conceptual foundations and frameworks for producing knowledge, how industry can intervene at that level and open up sort of new lines of research and new lines of questioning that double as a sort of mode of absolving industry for the implications for the effects of its products on the environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, Alyssa, you're shaking your head, so let me give you here, and then we'll go to Zuleika.
I'm just nodding because I think it's such a great paper and such an important point, because we do hear so much, we've gotten very used to hearing about the ways that that the oil majors have tried to misinform the public and to hide scientific research on climate change, and to sort of distort the public understandings of the science. And there's been a lot of work, obviously, in science studies and history of science on that. People like Leah Aronowsky, but it's really exciting. So it's exciting to see that kind of taken not only at the level of sort of dissemination or publicity per se, but to see Leah's article really think about how these companies and industries are directing some of the scientific practices and ideas themselves, and not just in the way of saying come up with a study that says that that actually climate change isn't a big deal, but that actually it's that I think diversionary practice is a great phrase for it, because it does, it's not an explicitly political intervention. It's something that sets this body of thought in motion, and has been, I think certainly we see has been taken up by many people. We see certainly not only Latour, you see it in Haraway's work, Bernard, you mentioned Haraway, we see it in a lot of just colloquially kind of Gaia as this important figure. And obviously Gaia as like a figure has a past before Lovelock too. So some of that is, I'm sure just kind of like an interest in like the pagan Gaia, but in any case, so I was just not excited. I think it's great to see that, and I really thought the article was excellent.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa. Zuleika, you work with Daniela, right?
Yes, I do. We are co-directors of the lab together. I'm happy to say, and very pleased to say, yeah. I think my question, or my kind of comment that I guess I offered up in the chat was, I coming also from an architectural background when I'm trying to deal with these issues, and I think that questions of line and where you draw the line, or how lines sort of operate and what they enact and what they don't enact, I think is an incredibly important problem. And unfortunately, because of its maybe associations with maybe old Cartesian logics, it's not one that's been, I think, rigorously enough theorized, at least on the side of maybe design or drawing sort of practices and knowledge formation. But I wanted to bring up first Robin Evans's seminal essay, where from the very get-go, he talks about how when you translate something, and this is before he gets into lines as translation, he always talks about the kind of field of disturbances where one thing becomes another. And he's talking just about like straight up translating a word from one language into another, but that's how he opens up the question of what drawing is as maybe a kind of agential practice, which I think is a bit of an overused phrase. But I also wanted to say that Deleuze's book on the dispositif is incredibly helpful when thinking about lines. He talks about the lines of the seeable and the sayable, and how they actually, like, he gives it a little bit more kind of concrete nature, in addition to the lines of flight, which I think is something like a praxis-based approach is attempting to situate itself in. But I think the last thing I'll say is that where objectivity maybe for the sciences and for science history in particular was kind of their thing to take on, and they've done so, I think, incredibly well, just thinking about like the feminist discourses and also Gallison and Daston's work on it. But in architecture, I would say our elephant or whatever is representation, because we have to deal with the problem of representationalism. And it's sort of, I think, onto-epistemological roots in the production of architectural representation. But I think that I don't think that it's something that's like dialectically good or bad, but rather if we rethink in terms of situatedness, that those things can also be inscribed on paper as lines, if they're thought with that level of complexity. So that's, I think, what I have to offer.
Great.
I could maybe just I'll add a little context. Thank you, Zuleika. Robin Evans, because I'm not sure that everybody here would know the reference. Shall we just give you the you're talking about the essay from translation from drawing to building, right? Yeah. So Robin Evans is entirely apropos. I completely agree. The architectural historian, he was an architectural historian of two things principally. One, drawing, as you just said, but also of prisons. And he really wrote the book on the Panopticon. And also there's some very important essays on the sort of spatial politics of the welfare state that articulate with some of the discussions in the previous, like the policing of families type discussions. Mm-hmm. So it's really apropos. But it does require translation. I totally agree, because otherwise, a set of concepts that might come from one practice, and when we say representation, it might mean something specific there to these other areas. But I don't know if you agree. But one of the I thought that you were going in this direction. When one of the deflationary moves, and I also thank Meredith Tenhor for her comment about environmental justice movements vis-a-vis Latour in the Q&A. But that we could make would be to revisit the critique of representation. This is maybe a little more controversial with respect to some of these discourses, because whether it's Deleuze, to some extent Foucault, and certainly, Latour, representation in the sense of even political representation, like standing in for something, tends to dissolve into the networks of, actor network theory and into a kind of practice-based epistemology. But I do think that it is important to think that's kind of like being on one side of the line is to answer the question, for what do you stand? Like what do you represent? And what, and I just have not been entirely convinced by the post-Deleuzian critique of representation to this extent. And it sounded like you were kind of saying something like that too. It's like, well, okay, let's declare some sort of a truce about that and think about what we mean by representation. And in a technical sense, like drawing something literally, to represent it, but also in a conceptual sense. Is that fair? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say so, and I think we are able to maybe move beyond that. The cartographic radical cartographers had the same issue kind of in the 90s, and they got over it in a productive way. And I think that maybe for some reason we're lagging behind, but there's no way that lines are not situated onto epistemological and ethical practices, and determining where they are and what side things fall on is absolutely, I think, what we should be kind of the experts in. So, yeah.
Good. Before we go to Ivan, Noah, I've been thinking a lot about topography in the context of the lawsuit at Standing Rock, because it's all about the topography, really. And so picking up on some of Reinhold's presentation, it's all about that highway being closed, meaning that you have to, head west down these treacherous kind of smaller roads where the topography is impossible. But I don't know, I think you were thinking of something as well, Noah.
Yeah, so it's like a number of thoughts. So I wanted to add a little maybe more texture to something that I think Leah talked about the sort of rewriting of reality, because I think it's another way in which I think I've at least seen a lot of rewriting of reality by these sort of moneyed interests is that Standing Rock. It's like you ask yourself, if you weren't there, how do you know it was happening at Standing Rock? Like, to some extent it was Facebook live videos, but I think for most people it was the news. And in a circumstance like this, where at least on one side of things you have the state with all of the authority that being the state lends, there were a lot of press releases and statements made by officers and even the governor that didn't align particularly well with the reality that I was seeing, or the reality that I was hearing from people who were firsthand witnesses to these things. And unsurprisingly, these sort of statements were often coming directly from the pipeline company, often through Tiger Swan, often in other ways. So like you have this public-private partnership that is leading toward what is effectively a fairly active disinformation campaign that then was picked up by the local newspaper. In part because the local newspaper wasn't able to go out and collect this information themselves because the road was closed by the people who were putting out the disinformation. The road closure made it dramatically more difficult to send a reporter from Bismarck, which is where the state's largest newspaper is located, to Standing Rock. Doubled, tripled the amount of time, sometimes just was impossible to go. But coming back to this question of lines, I also, it is like an interesting question in our case, in part because this essential legal question that is at the heart of the Eighth Circuit appeal right now is about the nature of the space of the road itself. That is the legal question that's going to determine whether or not the Eighth Circuit grants the defendants qualified immunity and dismisses the case against them, or denies them qualified immunity, allows them to proceed. It's like what the nature of the road is. And it's like, I can't help but thinking in engaging with this about, of course, how like strange of an argument this is in a sense about space that is morally, if not legally, and I think morally it's very straightforward, legally less so, not really US public space to begin with. This is space that should belong to the tribe. This is all space that was recognized as continuing to belong to the tribe by treaties that are still recognized as being good law. And so, I mean, you can either say the treaties have been abrogated because the doctrine of discovery, which is a very racist doctrine, gives the federal government the unilateral power to break the treaties they sign with the tribes, because the tribes are domestic dependent sovereigns and not equal sovereigns under US law. I mean, legally, that's an open question about whether or not the treaty has been abrogated. Morally, I don't think there's any question that this land should still belong to the tribe. So there is something a little bit, I think, odd about this legal question of this case, of people's right to be in this place to speak, turning on the nature of the place, but not like the moral, like this is actually their land, or at the very least it should be. That's not really part of what we're arguing. And I think this goes back to maybe something I heard from Daniela that I think is interesting, is just this idea of rights and like when you put yourself on what side of things. I'm like very sympathetic to very broad-based discussions of rights. And I know this is something Bernard and I have thought about a lot. There is like often a really difficult question that you have to ask yourself when you're putting theory into practice, and about like how broadly you want to argue for certain rights versus how much you want to tailor your arguments in a way that is most likely to lead to success. And in our case, the success in question is success in what is literally the colonial legal system. It was, I think, a difficult question for us to broach with the plaintiffs, at least number of the plaintiffs in the case. It's something I talked about with the plaintiffs about what it means for them to voluntarily be putting themselves into this legal system that is not the tribal legal system. But yeah, I do think that there are all these like really interesting questions that arise in terms of like how we think about things and then how we act based on how we think of these things, that I think, I don't know, I struggle with a lot as somebody who is I think both I mean, I'm a law professor, I'm a scholar, but also somebody who practices. I think it can lead to a lot of tough questions when you're figuring out like things like what is a right to breathe and what does it mean to say there's a right to breathe if that right is not recognized in the courts of the jurisdiction, or how do you get those rights to be recognized at Standing Rock? I mean, these sorts of conversations came up all the time. I know that there, especially in the criminal defense context, there was a lot of discussions about using the necessity defense, the defense that people needed to break like the laws of the states in order to prevent the like climate change, that there's this necessity for them to do these things. Now the necessity defense has been recognized sometimes, but it is not a widely recognized defense in US jurisdictions. I'm not sure if it's ever been recognized in North Dakota, which was the state in question. And so there's some real question about like, this felt like a really important thing to a lot of people, but also wasn't a legal strategy that seemed likely to lead to the exoneration of people either. Anyway, a lot of scatter shots about these things, but
no, that's really important. I mean, because it really goes to the relationship between critique and praxis, kind of like at its core. I mean, you've mentioned so many of the discussions we've had and struggles we've had, in part in trying to use particular tools that are possibly available, right? Not assuredly, possibly available, but that in some way reframe our intervention completely. And at the core, for instance, is this question of who really owns this road and this land, right? And in a way, the particular litigation that we're pursuing, which is a more kind of conventional 1983 civil rights lawsuit, kind of gives away that larger issue. It's, in other words, you know, there's no way in which that question is going to get us any traction. But of course, that's the whole thing right there, really. I mean, you know, we're kind of fighting over peanuts in a way, when the real issue has to do with whose land is this, right?
And I think in a lot of respects, sometimes the heartbreaking thing that comes up with making those sorts of decisions, I think, like you put it, giving away the issue. I don't know if I would phrase it in exactly those terms, but I mean, the risk of not, of essentially not giving away that issue, if our case had been much more directly framed in terms of whose land is this really, you run a real risk of actually giving it away. I mean, that's a lot of current federal Indian law thought is, among litigators, it's built around the idea of not litigating claims. It's the idea that we have a judiciary that is not open to a lot of these arguments. Once you litigate them and you lose them, they're often gone. That's how a lot of treaty rights have been recognized as being abrogated. It's because they've been litigated in front of courts that were not particularly likely to side with the tribes, and they haven't. And tribes have fewer rights now and less sovereignty than I think they did 150 years ago, in large part because of these sorts of things. And I think as painful as it can be to kind of step away from something, it's sometimes, I don't know, at least I think it's sometimes maybe necessary to let these sort of difficult issues go, or to frame things so that you're not engaging with maybe the bigger picture of everything.
Right. Well, particularly with this federal judiciary, with the exception maybe of that strange decision by Gorsuch, or, you know, yeah. Okay.
Can I maybe
yes,
add to something?
Yeah.
I found it extremely interesting what you said, Noah, and I would actually love to talk more about and learn more about the nature of the road, and whether or not the nature is meant as some kind of function, whether or not it's actually nature, and how law as language, you know, can, or interpretation can address that question of nature. But I want to speak to something else you said, because when we work about a right to breathe, which is multiple, you know, it will not be one. And in general, with these conversations, I think you're right. The question of whether or not to participate in a system that we know is violent and yet will matter in that case for lives, for bodies, over generations, is really difficult. But I also think that, and it's a similar question with human rights, right? Where, you know, we know where human rights are coming from and what the philosophical and conceptual ground for them is. And there is a violence. I don't think that you can get rid of it, no matter how many or how much you include in this circle. But I think you're right that that this is a question. I think that it's not a question about either or. Well, and we again, you know, with the dualism, because I think your work is extremely important, and it's always about our own fields and where the violences are and what we can do, and what, because you're doing that kind of work, Bernard is doing that kind of work, I can try to come in from a different angle and try to see how can we build differently with people on the ground, with people from different disciplines, reconceptualizing, building new forms of evidence, because you're right. I mean, there's no court that will simply say, oh yeah, you come here with the right to breathe. This is cool. So that's a lot of work, and we can do it because other people do very important work too. So I think you're right, but I don't think it's an either or thing.
Good, thanks, Daniela. Ivan, do you want to jump in? And I'm just noticing we've got a lot of architectural, where are you? Oh, there, you just moved. We've got a lot of architecture going on here. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is hopefully for everyone. So marginalized communities in the United States whose livelihoods and spaces of residence are financially intertwined with the workings of the carbon empire have been historically deemed expendable when it comes to public health questions of air toxicity ratings, the rates of pollution created not only by oil extrapolation and refining ventures, but by petrodiesel reliant industries such as commercial distribution centers and trucking. So many of these communities, despite California's strict environmental regulations, are paradoxically found here in the state. And they are arguably already living in a seemingly invisible climate apartheid, a color line, in which the boardrooms and municipal planning offices that Professor Martin notes in his article have an enormous part in selectively enabling the continued proliferation of petrodiesel reliant industries and enterprises in regions with low levels of education and high percentages of Black and Latino communities, while already limiting or scaling down operations in more affluent areas. So in imagining a pathway towards abolishing oil and meeting carbon reduction targets for the US, it's imperative that these communities are not only included, but prioritized in the environmental benefits of a reduction in carbon emissions, in the unrolling of a Green New Deal, in the abolition of oil. And thinking about the COVID-19 apartheid that these communities have experienced, are still experiencing in the US, I guess my question is, how can we ensure that the fair and just transition and inclusivity components of a Green New Deal do exactly that, as opposed to being reduced yet again to the optics-based lip service performed by authorities at the federal level?
Reinhold, Alyssa, do you have thoughts on that? In part, I mean, I was thinking of you, Reinhold, because it's so clear that our past experience with the New Deal was leveraging and accentuating those particular issues rather than addressing them. So, and one of the big questions here is whether it's whether it's possible to imagine the kind of governmental intervention associated with New Deal-esque interventions that don't play on those rifts in society. But go ahead, Reinhold.
Well, I'll just say this quickly because I think Alyssa also has quite a bit to say. That the Planet to Win book speaks to many of these issues too. Ivan is one of our wonderful PhD students and in architecture history. And I don't know if you know, your colleague Edison Goodell just defended a dissertation, one chapter of which told the story, and there's other scholarship on this as well, of Riverbank, which is the sewage treatment plant in Harlem that had been gradually basically moved in a kind of NIMBYism 101 kind of way, moved progressively north, and then dressed up in various ways that you described, it just kind of embodies the contradictions that you're describing in a kind of earlier moment. This is really, it took like decades to get this thing done in the first place, but it got finished in the early 90s, I think, but really the whole process starts like a couple of decades earlier. So, but one of the consequences of that was the formation, and there are many other such cases, of an environmental justice movement, essentially, the consolidation, the formation of groups like We Act in Harlem to oppose and then eventually negotiate, not satisfactorily. And the story is a tragedy, really, when you kind of unfold the details. But I was on Edison's committee, and after the defense, I emailed him and I said, this past summer, we with my partner Gadamri and our son Neelan attended a Black Lives Rally, joined a march there, and then attended a gathering on this big plaza. It's like this kind of very astroturf, basically soccer field that's at the top of the sewage treatment plant, that has become a kind of civic space, and it became a site of gathering for protest. It doesn't at all justify that place, but what was striking about it was that the particular environmental politics that you're describing were the topic of the speeches by representatives and other mostly local politicians and other movement folks who spoke in that particular situation. And I think that that's very important to, it doesn't resolve the problems that you're describing. But I tried to kind of play that out a little bit and just at least list in the post that I did on the blog post for this, other, left political movements, but also even elected representatives now. A lot of them are DSA people in the New York area. I listed many of them on the post, but who have, are doing, or at least trying to do exactly what Alyssa was describing, is kind of, in a sense, reclaim the state. And what you're saying also, as something other than an apparatus of control and domination and exploitation. And there's at least a kind of, to me, a poignancy and an urgency in that. And it's not coming, from Washington. It's these things are happening at a much different level.
Thanks, Reinhold. Alyssa, did you want to jump in? Because your book really does address a lot of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Although in some ways I'm not sure I have a lot to say, because I completely agree. And I think that is a crucial issue. And it's something that we did try to, to really imagine a Green New Deal that would be one that tackled and put racial justice and economic justice like at its heart and at its core, both as a matter of principle and as a matter of politics, of how do you build a real mass constituency for climate action that can last, that can deliver real benefits to people who have been bearing the burden of what Reinhold calls the carbon empire for a long time. And I think that is absolutely crucial. The answer to your question, though, I think is a very tough one, because I think we know what we need to do. There's not a as I'm sure there's not much of I think anything we can just come up with as a way to make sure that it happens. I think it's, can we organize and build enough power to ensure that the kinds of racial justice concerns you describe very clearly are at the heart of climate policy that passes and at the heart of a Green New Deal. And that, I think we're getting much closer to that than we have. Reinhold mentions a number of representatives who are like committed to what I would say is a kind of left version of the Green New Deal. So I'd add Cori Bush has a very exciting environmental justice and Green New Deal platform, and obviously she comes out of the Black Lives Matter movement. So that's exciting. It's obviously not. I don't think it's enough right now. I'm worried about that, certainly. But I guess to Bernard's question, I think I think we should be attentive to and concerned about the contradictions of the original New Deal, as Reinhold describes. But I also want to not have the New Deal be the only kind of historical moment we look to, because I think the Green New Deal, despite the name and many of the kinds of visions of public investment and so on, is also a project that draws on a lot of different kinds of political projects. It has a name that I think can sometimes be a little misdirecting in terms of focusing only on the New Deal as a historical model. But in any case, even looking to the New Deal, we're in a different historical moment, which means that there are many of the conditions which brought about the original New Deal are also not present. But I think that means that we have a different set of questions and problems. I think that the kinds of racial exclusion we would see in a contemporary Green New Deal are not the same ones we would see in the original deal, obviously, but that doesn't mean that other ones won't materialize. And this is why, one of the reasons why I think that we need to be thinking about the connection to the movements around the carceral state, around policing, how those are connected to, those are some of the questions of racial justice in our present moment that are so important. So, yeah, and sure, I don't have a solution other than I think a lot of political work that we have to do, and that I hope that we can do.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. Meredith Tenhur has a question, and it's actually more of a couple of comments, one for Reinhold and one for Daniela. She's occupied right now, so can't come live. So I'll read the question out, and then maybe since Alyssa just spoke, maybe we can have one final comment by Daniela. Thanks for staying with us and staying awake. It's now 2:38 for you, I think. And then Reinhold, you'll maybe close us out with some final thoughts, hopefully, on how this how this conversation flourished from since we started it last summer. So Meredith was saying to you, Reinhold, thanks for bringing up Latour, or thanks for bringing Latour down to earth. And she was suggesting we also think about Joey Todd's work for important reasons why this needs to happen, particularly argument that Latour's conceptual work erases, for instance, Inuit, Anishinabeg, and Nehiwayek knowledge. And so, and then to Daniela, thanks for recapitulation of opinions about the supposed lack of conceptual rigor in the conceptualization of environmental justice. And the point here is that it's important to name the racism that is at work in this denigration. The critique is directed toward a movement and a praxis led by Black and Brown people facing environmental racism. It would be great to further attend these forms of conceptual violence. So maybe Daniela, a final word from you, if you can still try the English rather than the German version, and then we'll let Reinhold finish us off for the evening.
Yes. Yeah, I think this is correct. And that's also kind of the point of the universalism. And I would not only, I think that's important to question also in relation to the zoning of science and, focusing on European models. And absolutely, I think that I think this is right. And also, this is why we put the book, The Energy Justice, New Horizons in Environmental and Energy Law series on that slide, which is edited by, let me see, Raya Salter, Carmen Gonzalez, and Elizabeth Ann Kronk. And this is really a book on energy justice that tries to take back that concept. A lot about indigenous ideas of energy justice, Black ideas of energy justice. So I think there's work to be done and is done to counter this. But yeah, I mean, this would take a while.
Great.
But maybe I stop with this.
Thanks, Daniela. So Reinhold, what do you think? I think this has been a great discussion. I couldn't have hoped for more back in Riverside Park in the early months of the pandemic. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's fabulous. I see that Arabella Colombier has just posted. I saw your hand up there too. I was going to say, I'll just read. Should we just read out this question?
Yeah, Arabella, why don't you go ahead? Go ahead, and then Reinhold, you can finish.
Yeah.
And thanks for, where are you? Oh, there you are. And thanks for all the work on the Standing Rock case.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be a part of that project. I'll just read what I put into the chat. So in the piece Abolish Oil, Reinhold Martin writes, if the Green New Deal is to decolonize the carbon empire, and then there's the rest of the part of that sentence, but that language of decolonization stuck out to me because it made me think of Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's piece, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, and the way that that term has been used often metaphorically and kind of watered down. And they talk about how the goals of social justice are often incommensurate with decolonization because fighting for things such as racial justice, economic equality, policies that would improve material conditions of people's lives in the United States, for instance, are still necessarily like upholding settler colonial states. And so I was wondering what it would mean or what if it could be possible to decolonize the carbon empire through the Green New Deal, which would be enacted through a settler colonial state.
Well, actually, I was kind of thinking a little bit a question along those lines when listening to Bernard and Noah discuss the legal problem of like at what level you pitch the lawsuit, because isn't it more or less the same that to actually, in a sense, literally, decolonize and or at least address the kind of primordial land grab and all of the violence that entailed, I think, Noah, you put it like this, like you would be risking the more immediate claims of the lawsuit. So you're pointing, if that's an accurate comparison, to I think a really critical contradiction, essentially. And And similarly, I think that, we began with the Red Deal, or Red New Deal, Red Deal, which analogously, makes claims, rights claims, and others that Bernard read out that are different than other efforts to, that might understand themselves as decolonizing. So, it seems to me that I don't have, it would be hubristic to actually try to answer your question in some how-to way. But I do think that one of the things that is kind of, you help me maybe, I don't know, forgive me if this is a little bit, of a stretch, but I wanted to ask generally, in the spirit of kind of trying to wrap up a little bit, is what to do with terms in this group. This is not a rhetorical question, and I can give you my answer, but I don't know that we agree collectively on this. What to do with kind of old-fashioned concepts like contradiction, like Hegelian problems, or wither dialectics here, which might also include the dialectics of settler and settle, or settler and colonized. Like, in other words, conflict, those kinds of sort of primordial founding, what Hegel referred to in the dialectic of lordship and bondage, chains. So it seems to me that we're not done with dialectics yet. We're not done with these old kind of burdens of contradiction. And so, I think, for example, on the question that Alyssa raised just now about the New Deal, one way I would suggest dwelling on these things would be to dwell. Du Bois himself did this, in the offices of the crisis that he edited, and in other, so-called real world sites that he and his colleagues inhabited as they fought struggles that very frequently, including in education, higher education, that were, in a way, more than compromises. They accepted, in a manner that I think is similar to what Bernard and Noah are talking about, the premises of the master. They used, in a sense, the master's tools in a way that, at least in the moment, could be understood as oriented towards justice. So, that's certainly not a formula, but it strikes me that so we could, with any of these examples, the terms that we use, like decolonize, and other strategies, just kind of be a little humble about the contradictions, and do, like, forgive me, the old Marxists used to do, and try to work through them. And then just one more thing to add in terms of the histories, that it sort of towards the end of that piece, and this is actually something we're pursuing a bit at the Buell Center, the center that I direct at Columbia, and my colleagues, Jacob Moore and Jordan Steingart, I think they're still kind of bravely online here, but my kind of real comrades and collaborators in this work, we've tried in a non-metaphorical sense, but this is it's just as difficult as what you're asking about, Arabella, that to think reconstruction as a paradigm, and to put the term green in front of reconstruction and see what that does. Because there, that was, of course, Du Bois's problem during the New Deal era. It's like the New Deal looks soft, basically, in relation to the military occupation of the South, the institutionalization of freedmen's bureaus and all these other efforts simply to claim voting rights and property rights and all of those things. And so back from the master, or the former master, who remained in Jim Crow and, of course, well beyond, in that position. So I think that something like, in a sense, testing one set of examples or problems with another, that may be latent within them. I think there are other things that we can do with respect to the science, the histories of science that we were discussing earlier, as well, in this way, and truth claims and so on. might be, has been, at least for me, a racial strategy and a certain humility. And I'll just kind of end with this, so when I was saying about the kind of joining the protest on Riverbank, we were doing so from the wrong side of the other side of the line. I mean, the line in that case is, these lines in that case is basically 125th Street, which Columbia now has managed to occupy in its own way. But that we must, I think, always remember that when we join in solidarity, we do so in contradiction often. And that kind of work, I think, is there's no sort of simple formula, Latourian or otherwise, to get us out of that one. So I'll leave it there because it looks like we're beyond the line of 8:45.
Is a perfect. That is a perfect place to end, I think, with some question marks for us to continue thinking. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Alyssa, Daniela, thanks for staying with us till the wee hours of the morning. Reinhold, thank you so much for conceiving of this idea and bringing it to fruition. Zuleika, thanks for joining us. Arabella, for all the work. Noah, for all of the extraordinary work you're doing, you're leading. Leah, for that great paper, which we loved reading. And Ivan and others, Mayaki, Hedwig, Kadar, Lingen, Cletus, Brandon, everyone, thanks for being here. And we will meet next on Thursday, April 1st. And that's so April 1st, that's not a April Fool's Day. We will be here. And we're going to be turning to the question of borders and open borders. We have extraordinary participants, Joseph Cairns, who really is the grandfather of the open borders thinking, Professor Sheila Ben Habib of now of Columbia Law School, also from Yale, who's been writing so much about migration and the right to have rights, and Paulina Ocheo Espejo, who has also been writing in the field. We've got terrific readings already up, and so I encourage you to join us for that session of Abolition Democracy 1213 on open borders on April 1. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for all the contributions and for thinking critically together. It's been a really major. I've grown a lot through this conversation, and also from reading you and your incredible pieces. So thank you so much. See you soon. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.
Bye. Take care. Thanks.